Late in January 1975, a 17-year-old German girl named Vera Branders walked out onto the stage of the Cologne Opera House, vast venue. On this occasion, it was 1,400 empty seats, lit only by the dim green glow of the emergency exit signs. Still, even though the room was empty, this was the most exciting day of Vera's life. She had somehow managed to become the youngest concert promoter in Germany. See, Vera was a girl who just loved jazz, and being an entrepreneurial spirit, she started organizing jazz concerts in order to see more jazz in Cologne. And almost immediately, she had scored this remarkable coup. She had persuaded this vast venue, the Cologne Opera House, to host a late-night improvised performance by the American jazz great Keith Jarrett. Just a few hours, Jarrett would be walking out on the stage and he'd be playing whatever came into his head. No sheet music, no rehearsal, purely improvised. The reason that Vera was on stage that afternoon was to introduce Keith to the piano. It wasn't going well. The moment Keith saw the piano, he shook his head. He went over, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Played a few chords, shook his head again. His producer came over, they talked together in hushed tones. The producer tried a couple of chords, more shaking of heads. You can imagine how Vera's feeling right now. And then Jarrett's producer comes over to Vera Branders and says, if you don't get a new piano, Keith won't play. There'd been some kind of mix-up. Jarrett had been very specific about the kind of piano he wanted, and somehow the removal crew at the Opera House had brought up a rehearsal model, a tiny little thing. Vera later said it was a tiny piano. It was like half a piano. It was out of tune. Pedals were sticking. The felt was worn away in the upper registers, so they sounded harsh and tinny. Some of the notes were sticking. It was unplayable. Even the volume, the fact that it was such a small instrument, you couldn't even hear it at the back of the auditorium. And so, of course, Jarrett refused to play unless a replacement was found. So Vera got on the phone, but it's West Germany, Friday afternoon, 1975. It's not going to happen. They've all gone home. It turns out there's just no way, not enough time to replace the piano. So Vera calls a piano tuner to try to at least get the thing in tune. But he's not going to be able to fix what's wrong with this instrument. And so Vera does really the only thing that she can do. She runs outside and looks for Keith Jarrett. It's raining heavily. Jarrett is sitting in a car, waiting to be driven back to his hotel. So Vera knocks on the window and he winds the window down. It's the 70s. And she crouches down to get at eye level. And she begs him. She begs him to play. And Jarrett looks out of the window, this rain-drenched German teenager. He thinks about the 1,400 people who've paid good money to come and see him play. He thinks about what they're going to do to her when he doesn't show up. And he takes pity on her. He says, never forget. Only for you. And so, later that evening, in front of a packed auditorium, Jarrett walks out alone on stage and he sits down at a piano that he knows is unplayable. And he begins. And within moments it becomes clear that there's something magical happening. And Jarrett's avoiding the upper register of the instrument because it sounds so harsh and tinny. He sticks to the middle register, and that gives the piece this very soothing ambient quality. But that's not enough because the instrument's so quiet. So he adds this rumbling, repetitive riff in the bass. And to try to get the volume, to try to be heard at the back of the room, he's standing up, he's pounding down on the keys with all the energy he can muster. And there's something about this combination of these quite soothing choices of note and the energy with which he's playing them that is electrifying. And the audience love it. And in fact, audiences continue to love it. Because Jarrett's producer, Manfred Eicher, decided to record the concert. He wanted documentary evidence of what a musical catastrophe sounds like. But he didn't get a catastrophe. He got a masterpiece. And the Köln Concert album is the best-selling solo jazz piano album in history. And 2 of my children were born while my wife was listening to the Köln Concert album. They're actually in the room. My wife has mixed feelings about the music now. I still like it, I have to say. But there's something very beautiful about it, something ineffable. Jarrett was handed this mess, and when he was finally persuaded to embrace it, he soared. I've been fascinated by this story ever since I heard it. And 2 things in particular caught my attention. One was Jarrett's reaction. I mean, this is a man who gets on stage every day, just sees what comes into his head. I mean, he's a very adventurous musician. I'm pretty sure I know how the orchestra would respond if I said, let's just see what happens. Let's just try something. I haven't asked because I'm their guest and it would be rude. But I guess I know what the response would be. It's an unusual kind of musician who wants to perform like that. But even he did not, when he saw the unplayable piano, say, a terrible piano, this is brilliant. I wonder how it'll stimulate my creative juices. He said, it's a terrible piano, it's going to be a terrible concert, I don't want to do it. Of course he did. Any of us would, in any remotely comparable situation. And that's the other thing. So are there comparable situations? Could we see the same pattern? Could we draw the same conclusions? Could we find the same performance within ourselves when we, as we're going through our everyday lives, suddenly find impossible deadlines, impossible colleagues, tools that break in our hands, global pandemics, just stuff that happens that you would think is going to ruin everything, and yet somehow, which makes us rise to the occasion. We learn new things, we try new things, we surprise ourselves. So, could that happen? Does that happen? This was, I believe, billed as a scientific talk, so you'll want proof. Okay, let us start with fonts. There's a study done by a group of psychologists led by Daniel Oppenheimer. They teamed up with high school teachers and they asked the teachers to give their students coursework and homework assignments formatted in particular fonts. And this was chosen at random, so some classes would get the classic fonts, Helvetica, Times New Roman, you know, all the old favourites. And other classes, also chosen at random, would get exactly the same handout, except it would be formatted in, say, Hattenschweiler, very sort of dense Germanic kind of font, or the handwritten curves of monotype Corsiva, or the zesty bounce of Comic Sans italicized. These are called, there's a technical term, you want to know what Comic Sans italicized is called? It is called a disfluent font. It means it's hard to read. And what this experiment found was that the students who had been given the disfluent reading materials actually did better in their end-of-term exams. Why? Probably because when they saw monotype Corsiva or Comic Sans, they thought, what on earth is this? It caught their attention. And then when they tried to read it, it was a little bit difficult, so they slowed down, they had to think a bit more, make a few more connections. Think about being given a document written in Times New Roman. is it's so easy to read you kind of feel you've already read it and you don't really want to read it. There's even, inspired by this research, there's even a new font. It's called Sans Forgetica. It's true. It's got kind of bits missing from it. It's kind of hard to read, and I suppose that's the point. But look, you're saying, hang on a minute. When you when you published your last book, How to Make the World Add Up, available in Blackwell's and all other good bookstore shops, you didn't format it in Sans Forgetica. You don't really believe this stuff. And yeah, I'm not sure I want to read a book in Sans Forgetica. So are there other examples, maybe more practical, more everyday examples? Well, yes, there are. So before the pandemic, I used to commute to an office in London Bridge. So I have to get to the train station, go to Paddington, and then need to get across London on the Underground. I knew exactly which escalator to take to go down to the Bakerloo line, where to stand on the Bakerloo line, so that when the doors opened at Baker Street, I'd be right opposite the corridor that took me across to the Jubilee Line platform, but not just any part of the Jubilee Line platform. The part of the Jubilee Line platform that would get me at the back of the Jubilee Line train, which when it arrived at London Bridge Station would be at the end of the platform that was closest to the escalator for Borough Market, which means I would be at the front of the escalator for Borough Market, and I'd be at the front of the queue at the Monmouth Coffee House for coffee. And I swore when I started working in London I would never become that guy, but I did become that guy. And people who commute regularly, they do become those kinds of people. We get very good. We carve a groove. We know how we want to get to work. We've had a lot of practice. So if my theory is true, that actually disruption and obstacles can actually produce a problem-solving response, if there were a disruption to people's progress around the tube network, they would get better at commuting. Well, it's quite a theory. Well, it turns out a few years ago there was a tube strike. Lasted 48 hours, closed down half the stations on the Underground. Some lines were closed, some lines were open. People could still travel around on the buses, on the overground trains. And 3 economists I know did what any self-respecting economist would do, which was immediately get hold of the data set from Transport for London. So suitably anonymized, they could see how people responded to the tube strike. And of course, what happens when the tube strike hits is lots and lots of people change the way they get to work. You can see it. They're on the bus, or they've found a different way around the tube network, something like that. And at the end of the tube strike, which is only 48 hours, most of them go back to the way that they were always commuting, of course. But the thing is, tens of thousands of them never go back. All it took was a 48-hour tube strike to realize they had been doing commuting wrong all their lives. They found a better way to do it. I mean, Keith Jarrett could have played the piano the way he played it at any time with any piano. But it was only when all of these constraints were imposed upon him that he chose that kind of way to play, those sorts of notes. When the way that we want to do things is blocked, we have to try a different way. And sometimes the different way is the way that we should have tried all along. I mean, you can see this in the pandemic, and I don't mean to compare the pandemic, which has been a tragedy, to a bad piano or a tube strike that lasts 48 hours. Clearly, they're not comparable. But the same pattern can be seen. It's that first lockdown where everybody outside Downing Street was obeying the rules and trying to find a way to connect with people. And we all sort of found, oh, there's this Zoom thing, and then there's Skype. Well, Skype's been around since 2005. And we'll just connect with some neighbours, just check in that they're okay, or some friends. We'll organise a little Zoom kind of cocktail party and so on. And then about a week into it, you go, hang on a minute, I've got friends in America. I haven't seen them for 6 years. We could Zoom them. And you do. And you say, why on earth didn't we do this before? Little things compared to the enormity of what's happened. But nevertheless, we experiment and we learn, often kicking and screaming, because we're forced to, just as Keith Jarrett had to be forced to. I mean, the example that always sticks in my mind, the thing that makes me feel uncomfortable, it's people. I mean, I'm more of a spreadsheet guy myself. People are awkward. So people are, I always feel they're the unplayable piano for me. But there's a fascinating study of this by a psychologist called Catherine Phillips, that she gave people murder mystery problems to solve. So what would happen is you get this little dossier, there's an alibi, there's witness statements, stuff like that, and you read through it, and photographs of the crime scene, and you have to figure out who committed the crime, A, B, or C. It's like a little puzzle. Now, if you give this to most people, give them 20 minutes, the success rate is 45%, which is not great because it's multiple choice. So if you gave it to chimps, the success rate would be 33%. Okay, so chimps, humans, okay. Catherine Phillips gave it to groups of 4 people, and it was a randomized trial. So half of the groups were groups of 4 friends, and their success rate went up to 55%. Chimps, 33, human, 45, 4 friends, 55% success rate. That was half of the randomized trial. The other half of the randomized trial, for maximum social awkwardness, 3 friends, 1 stranger. Success rate, 75%. So, just so you're following, that's about as much better than the group of 4 friends as the group of 4 friends is better than the chimp. Not because the stranger had any extra knowledge, just because there was something about the difficulty of trying to have this conversation to solve this problem together. Everyone kind of brought their best game and behaved themselves and was clearer about the way they spoke or something. We don't really know. But it's an enormous effect. But what really interests me is not the size of the effect. What really interests me is how people felt about it. Catherine Phillips interviewed people, and the groups of 4 friends, when they were asked, well, how was it? They were like, yeah, great, talk to my friends was great. Okay, but what about how good was the conversation? Were you solving the problem? Oh yes, I think we did. We had a very good conversation, very clear, very structured, well organized, good quality conversation. Do you think you solved the problem? Have you got the right man? Yeah, I think we have. Ask the groups of 3 friends and the stranger, didn't have a good time. Okay, fine, felt a bit uncomfortable, a bit awkward. But did you have an effective conversation? No, they said, we don't think we did. Well, do you think you got the right man? No. No confidence at all. So these are people, what's happening there is they're taking their feeling of discomfort and they're interpreting that as, this isn't working, we're not being creative, we're not solving the problem. And the people who were feeling comfortable were misinterpreting that as effective decision making. But it wasn't, it was just feeling comfortable. And we all like to feel comfortable. I like to feel comfortable. But sometimes it's the discomfort that really gets us solving problems, that really gets us being creative. Well, so that's a problem, isn't it? Yeah, because we are going to systematically avoid those obstacles, that randomness, that disruption. Systematically avoid that discomfort. And what's more, we won't even realize that it's causing us a problem. And when we do run into the problems, when life does throw us this random curveball, we're going to think it's a problem, even actually when we're finding a great solution, even when it's stimulating us to be more creative. So we're going to avoid the disruptions of life. We're going to avoid the mess of life. And sometimes that's okay because you know what? The disruption comes for us anyway. But I wonder if we notice the opportunities that are sometimes presented. And I wonder if we can't, from time to time, seek out a little more gentle discomfort, something a little easier to handle than a traumatic 2-year global pandemic. So I was thinking about this, and then I thought, I know who to ask. Brian Eno. Talk to Brian Eno about this problem. I've divided the room, I see. Half the people in the room are going, wow, he talked to Brian Eno. The other half are like, who is Brian Eno? So Brian Eno's an ambient composer, artist, very interesting thinker, and a producer. So famously worked as a producer with Twyla Tharp, with Devo, with U2, Paul Simon, Coldplay, most famously with David Bowie. And I said, so why do all these bands ask you to be their producer? And he said, well, It's because they've made a great album, it's been very successful, and their record company wants them to do exactly the same thing, and they kind of feel that actually they need to do something a bit different, but they can't because they're scared and it makes them feel uncomfortable, and that's when they call me. It's the unplayable piano for hire. And one of the things he does, the gentle little things, is he uses this deck of cards called the oblique strategies. And they're just lovely little things. They've just got random instructions on towards the insignificant. What does it mean? I don't know. Have a conversation, figure it out, do something. Be extravagant. Use unqualified people. The orchestra are thinking that about their speaker at this point, I expect. Or actually quite similar, this is one of my favorites, change instrument roles. Change instrument. Fancy it? Yeah, come on. No, okay. So far you've got the best drummer in the world and you've got the best guitarist in the world. And the guitarist is on the drums and the drummer's on the guitar. Sounds crazy, except this is how they made heroes. Carlos Alomar, brilliant jazz guitarist, on the drums, hating it. Hating it. They hated it. Musicians did not like this. They said it was stupid, they said it sounded bad, and then out comes Low, out comes Lodger, out comes Heroes. And they had to go, yeah, maybe there was something in that stupid deck of cards after all. Carlos Alomar once said, it was like getting slapped in the face using the cards. He said, they took me to this different place, and to be honest, I didn't like the place. And yet when I came back, I was fresh. Maybe there is something in them after all. The cards were originally just a list on the studio wall, kind of reminders, things to try, principles to bear in mind. That didn't work because you look at the list and you go, which is the least possible disruption? What's the most comfortable thing? We'll pick that one. The cards, they're random. You just have to pick something and you have to deal with it. And I heard recently Carlos Alomar is now using the cards with the students he teaches to play guitar. He says, I want them to feel what I felt. I guess he finally figured out, just because you don't like it doesn't mean it isn't helping you. But that's the thing about obstacles, randomness, disruption, mess, difficult people, hard to read fonts. We don't seek them out. I don't seek them out. And maybe we should seek them out a little bit more. That's the genius of these silly little cards. Yeah, they're just a gentle little way to force you to do something or to think in a way that you never would have wanted. And we need that. We need that kind of encouragement. However it comes. Maybe it's a conversation with a stranger. Maybe it's a teacher who gives us a document in a really weird font. Or maybe it's a guilt trip from a German teenager. But wherever that impetus comes from time to time, all of us need to make ourselves sit down and try to play the unplayable piano. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for listening. Thank you.